prisoner had been brought in a little after 4 in the morning, and by the time the sun came up over the frozen reservoir, he had been sitting in the corner of that command tent for 2 hours, watching the Marines around him with an expression that none of them could quite read. He was a captured officer, a battalion commander, they thought, though nobody was entirely sure yet. He spoke English. That was the thing that had gotten him moved from the collecting point up to the regimental command post in the first place, because an enemy field officer who spoke English at Chosin in the winter of 1950 was worth talking to. And at some point that morning, while the staff worked around him, and the cold came through the canvas walls the way it came through everything in that country, the prisoner looked across the tent at the barrel-chested American colonel who was reading a message form by the light of a field lamp, and he asked him a question. He asked why the Marines had not broken. He did not ask it the way a man asks something he wants to argue about. He asked it the way a man asks something that has been genuinely keeping him awake, because by every calculation he had been trained to make, by every number he had been given, the regiment in front of him should have come apart days ago. Colonel Lewis Puller put the message form down. He looked at the prisoner for a moment, and what he said in answer was one word. Not a speech, not a lecture about the United States Marine Corps. One word, and then he picked the message form back up. What that word was, and why it landed on that particular man the way it did, is the reason his interpreter remembered the exchange for the rest of his life. If you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, take a second and hit that subscribe button. Let me back up, because to understand why that question was worth asking, and why the answer mattered, you have to understand where that command tent was and what was happening outside it. In late November of 1950, the 1st Marine Division was strung out along a single mountain road on the western side of the Chosin Reservoir in the far north of Korea, and around it, in the hills, in numbers that the men on the ground would not fully understand until much later, was the better part of 10 Chinese divisions. That is not a figure of speech. The Marines were surrounded. Not surrounded in the sense of a line that had been flanked, surrounded in the sense of a formation, sitting in a bowl of high ground with the enemy on every side of it, in the coldest winter that part of Asia had seen in decades, at temperatures that fell to 30 and 35 degrees below zero at night. Weapons froze. Morphine froze in the syrettes and had to be thawed in a medic's mouth before it could be used. Men who stopped moving died. And the plan that the Chinese command had built, the plan the officer in that tent had been part of executing, was a good plan. It was the plan you would draw up if you had overwhelming numbers and an enemy strung out on a single road. You cut the road in several places at once. You separate the column into pockets, and then you reduce the pockets one at a time, because a surrounded force that has been cut into pieces is supposed to do a specific thing. It is supposed to lose cohesion. It is supposed to have units that surrender, sectors that collapse, a line that comes apart under the pressure of being hit from every direction in impossible cold, with no realistic hope of relief. That is what surrounded armies had done throughout military history. It is what the arithmetic said should happen. Now, here's the thing. The arithmetic was not wrong about the numbers. The Chinese did have the numbers. The Marines were outnumbered by a margin that, on paper, should have settled the matter. What the arithmetic could not account for was the thing the prisoner was asking about. Because the regiment had not come apart. The pockets had held. Units that were cut off had formed perimeters and fought in every direction and waited to be reached. The line had bent and had not broken, and the division was not collapsing inward toward destruction. It was preparing, in a phrase that would later become famous, to attack in a different direction, to fight its way out as a formation, bringing its wounded and its dead, and its equipment with it, down the same road it had come up. And the man in that tent, the enemy officer who had helped plan the encirclement, had watched this happen from the other side of the hill, and it did not fit anything he knew. His army was brave. His soldiers attacked through machine gun fire in human waves and kept coming. Courage was not the variable he was missing. He had plenty of courage on his own side of the line, and he had seen it spent. What he could not account for was why, when the Marines were cut off and freezing and outnumbered, and by every reasonable measure finished, the thing that was supposed to happen did not happen. Why there was no unraveling. Why the pockets did not panic. Why a surrounded regiment behaved less like a trapped animal and more like a fist. That is the question he brought into the tent. And it was a real question, from a professional soldier about a professional problem. Here's what doesn't survive in the official record. The interpreter who was in that tent, a young Marine who had grown up in a Chinese-speaking household in California and had been pulled out of a rifle company for exactly this kind of work, said later that the prisoner was not afraid. He had expected a frightened man. Prisoners at that point in that campaign often were. This one was not. He was something closer to puzzled, in the specific way that an intelligent man is puzzled when the world has just done something his entire education told him it could not do. And the interpreter said that when the prisoner asked the question, several of the Marines in the tent looked up, because it was the question a few of them had been half asking themselves. Not out loud. You did not say out loud at Chosin that by rights you should already be finished. But the thought was there, in the cold, in the math that anyone could do, and here was the enemy, saying it plainly, from the outside. Stay with me, because what Puller did with that question is the part almost nobody tells. He could have ignored it. He was a regimental commander in the middle of the hardest fight of his life, and he did not owe a captured enemy officer an answer to anything. He could have given the speech. There was a speech available. Every senior Marine had a version of it, about the Corps and its history and the meaning of the eagle, globe, and anchor, and a lesser man in that moment, a man who was performing rather than commanding, might have reached for it, because the audience was right there and the enemy had handed him the opening. He did neither. The accounts that survive are consistent on the shape of it, and less consistent on the exact wording of what surrounded it. What they agree on is that Puller put the message form down, and looked at the man, and did not raise his voice, and did not make a thing of it. He said one word. He said trained, and then he picked the message form back up and went back to reading it, because there was a war going on outside the tent, and he had a regiment to get down a road. And this is where it gets complicated, because on the surface, it is almost a letdown. The enemy officer asks the great question, the one about courage and spirit and the soul of an army, and the famous colonel answers with a single flat word about training, and goes back to his paperwork. But the interpreter said the word landed on the prisoner like a stone dropped into still water. Because the prisoner understood exactly what it meant. He was a professional. He had built the encirclement, and what Puller was telling him, in one word, was that what he was watching was not a miracle, and not a mystery, and not some mystical quality of the American character that his own men lacked. It was the predictable output of a system. It was men who had been drilled, every one of them, rifleman and cook and clerk and driver, until the things that make a surrounded unit come apart had been trained out of them, and the things that make it hold had been trained in, so deep that they still operated at 35 below zero with the enemy on every side. The Chinese soldier was brave. Puller was not disputing that. But bravery is a quality a man brings. Training is a quality an army builds. And a surrounded regiment does not survive on the bravery its men happened to bring that day. It survives on what was built into all of them, in advance, on purpose, so that it would still be there on the worst night of their lives when bravery alone would not have been enough. That was the whole answer. That was why it was one word. See, what most people miss about this story is that they think the word was modest, that Puller was being humble, deflecting a compliment about his men. He was not being humble. He was being precise. Because the alternative answers, the flattering ones, the ones about spirit and heart and the special character of the American fighting man, are the answers that feel good and explain nothing, worse than nothing. An army that believes it holds together because of some quality its men are born with is an army that has stopped doing the thing that actually makes it hold, which is the endless, unglamorous, repetitive work of training every man to a standard, so that the standard survives contact with terror and cold and exhaustion and being surrounded in the dark. Spirit is what you say afterward, at the reunion, with a drink in your hand. Training is what you do beforehand, in the rain, when nobody is watching and everybody is bored, so that afterward there is anybody left to hold the reunion at all. Puller knew the difference. He had spent 30 years on the doing side of it, and when an enemy officer handed him the flattering question, he did not take it, because taking it would have been a lie, and the truth was both simpler and far more demanding. The prisoner, the accounts say, was quiet for a long time after that. The interpreter's name was, by his own later account, one of the men pulled from a line company for language work, and he came home and did not talk about most of Chosin for many years, the way most of them did not. But this exchange, he told, more than once, because of the look on the prisoner's face when the single word landed, and because of what it taught a 20-year-old about the difference between the things that sound true and the things that are. The 1st Marine Division fought its way out of the Chosin Reservoir over the following days. It came down the road as a formation. It brought its wounded. It brought its dead. It brought its equipment. It broke out through the divisions that had surrounded it and reached the coast. And it did it in the worst cold and against the worst odds of the entire war. And it did it, in the end, for the reason Puller had given the prisoner in a single word, in a cold tent before the breakout began. Not because the men were braver than their enemy. They were not necessarily braver than their enemy. Because of what had been trained into them, in advance, on purpose, by men who understood that you cannot issue courage on the worst night of a man's life, but you can spend the years beforehand making sure he does not need to be issued it. So, was Puller right, that it came down to training, and not to something rarer? Some would say no, that reducing what those men did at Chosin to training takes something away from it, that there was a spirit in that division that no drill instructor put there, and that calling it training is a cold word for one of the bravest things any American unit has ever done, and that some things really are more than the sum of the hours that went into them. Others would say that this is exactly the sentimental answer Puller refused to give, and for good reason, that every army tells itself it has special spirit, right up until the night it discovers it does not, and that the only thing that has ever actually carried men through the moment when spirit runs out is what was trained into them before they needed it. That the word was not cold, it was the most respectful thing he could have said, because it was true. Let us know where you land in the comments below, and if you want more untold stories from the men who actually fought these wars, make sure you subscribe.